Welcome to Talkback Radio Network, the home of the Iron Microphone, with your hosts, Dr. Lawrence Gelman and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg.
And good morning, Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg and Dr. Lawrence Gelman with you this morning. Later on in the program, we'll be speaking with Thomas Mullen, author of A Return to Common Sense, Reawakening Liberty in the Inhabitants of America. He is a libertarian who very ardent supporter of Ron Paul, and we'll be speaking a little bit about that later on in the program. Good morning, Dr. Gelman.
Hello.
All right, what's on the agenda for our first segment?
We live in a fascist dictatorship, and so the question is, how did that happen? All governments want to enslave their populations, and they do it through different means, whether they call it a democracy, a democratic republic, dictatorship, aristocracy. It really doesn't matter. The philosophy of the average politician is the same. Their personal characteristics are arrogance combined with ignorance, which is a really terrible combination, and they are extremes on both ends. And so the question arises, how did this country that was based upon the principles found in the Declaration of Independence, which is the sacredness of life and the rights of the individual, that the individual was the ultimate authority in the country and not the government, that we believe these rights to be natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So on a founding of that type of ideology, how do we become the fascist country that we have become today? Well, it is not an accident, and it is typical of all politicians. But we can trace this back throughout U.S. history, and we're going to do that right now. And the question that arises that made me look into this was, how is it that a federal court system is able to overturn a state law? How is it that a single justice on a local federal court can overturn a referendum approved by millions upon millions of individuals? Is it possible that our founding fathers created an environment that said that the will of the people would be subservient to an appointed for life by politicians federal judge? Is that possible? No, that is not possible, but that is something that we've come to believe. The United States was created on a system of checks and balances as delineated in the Constitution. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the federal judiciary, all of whom have particular functions, and all of which were in the Constitution could balance and check each other, including the ultimate authority, which is we the people, because the Constitution says we the people. It does not say I the king. It does not say the aristocracy. It does not say the government. It says we the people in order to form a more perfect union. The Constitution was created by we the people and not by the government. The government is to work to guarantee the rights of the people. So we no longer have a system of checks and balances. We have a hierarchical environment today as far as government, with the masses of the people at the very bottom with very little power or none at all, and then building its way up through the apex, which is not the president but the federal court system. And why did our government evolve in that manner? Because the federal court system is not answerable to the people. And therefore, it is an easy way for the other two branches, the legislative and the executive branch, to drive the country towards a fascist state, and under the umbrella of being legal, of being constitutional. So and you have the Supreme Court made up of appointees. We're going to get into that. Made up of appointees that were supposed to they were never meant to interpret the law or the Constitution. They were just supposed to determine whether what was in the Constitution was being adhered to or not. So where did it all begin? Well, it all began way back near the beginning, right around the time most of the founding fathers had passed on. What a coincidence. The the Supreme Court and the federal courts routinely overturn state legislation and dictate terms to the states and the citizens. The Supreme Court acquired this power through an assumption of ultimate interpretive supremacy over the Constitution and all legislation of the land, a power it does not constitutionally have, but which it unilaterally usurped with the connivance of the Congress and the executive branch of government, beginning with the Marbury versus Madison decision in 1803. At the time, outgoing President John Adams of the Federalist Party attempted to pack the judiciary with Federalist judges before the inauguration of Republican anti-Federalist Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson refused to authorize the appointments and was then sued by one that was denied their judicial appointment, a William Marbury. The power to confirm judges had been granted to the judiciary by an act of Congress in 1783. The dilemma that Marshall faced was how to maintain Federalist authority without directly confronting President Jefferson in a battle that Chief Justice Marshall could not win. The ingenuous answer of Marshall was to satisfy Jefferson by refusing to grant the judgeship to Marbury or any of the other appointees of John Adams, not by agreeing to Jefferson's refusal, but rather by asserting that the legislation which had augmented the power of the Supreme Court through a legislative act of Congress was anti-constitutional, declaring that Congress lacked the authority to have power, direct power over the judiciary. Ironically, Marshall, intentionally by the way, in the act of striking down legislation, a legislation which had increased the power of the court, gained something far more important, ultimate interpretive power over the Constitution. Anti-Federalist Thomas Jefferson unwittingly had fallen into the Federalist trap. The present-day ramifications of Marshall's decision have been the complete subverting of the Constitution to the interpretation of the Supreme Court, and by doing so, by extension, granted the power over the Constitution to the central government. If we look at Marshall's Marbury versus Madison decision, we can elucidate the deviousness of his intent. Marshall's decision seemingly drew directly from Article 3 of the Constitution. In the decision, Marshall writes, "The Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party. In all other cases, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction." To the untrained eye, this is an exact copying of what is said in the Constitution in the powers of the judiciary. However, Marshall's opinion omits two crucial words which are actually found in the Constitution itself. The text of the Constitution says that it says that in all other cases before mentioned, referring to the limitations of powers found in Article 3, Section 2, which limits the judiciary, but by omitting the words before mentioned and leaving in all other cases, it makes it appear as if the Supreme Court has ultimate authority in all other cases in the land, when in actuality its authority is limited by what is actually listed in the Constitution itself in the enumeration of powers. Let us see why his interpretation is completely incorrect. The legislative process is delineated in Article 1, Section 1, and the participants in the legislative process are the Congress, the Senate, and the President. There is no mention of the Supreme Court in the legislative process. The size of the federal court system is determined not by the judiciary, but by the Congress. For as Article 1, Section 8 states, the Congress shall have the power to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court.
You are listening to the Talkback Radio Network. We hope you're being enriched by our program today. You may be listening via our archives or to our live broadcast. Dr. Gelman and Rabbi Rosenberg broadcast live on Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern, 10 to 11 a.m. Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. You may call the show live during those times, toll-free at 888-930-1787, 888-930-1787, or you can find us in the archives 24/7 at ironmicrophone.com.
If you're a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan, like me, coming home can be harder than expected, but it turns out I wasn't alone. At IAVA.org, there's a free online community of thousands of vets who've got your back. Whether it's managing the transition home or everyday stuff like finding a nice sweater for my dog.
Sweater?
Okay, maybe not that. Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America is there for you. Join our community at IAVA.org.
We've got your back.
Brought to you by IAVA and the Ad Council.
Dr. Lawrence Gelman is a South Texas-based physician and hospital administrator. His mission is to empower Americans with knowledge that will help change the direction of our country. Dr. Gelman has produced a series of DVDs with the facts on myriad political, social, and economic issues. At this time, he is so passionate about our country and the state of our government that he's declared a moratorium on any costs associated with his DVDs. He'll even pay the postage. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the store link. Choose from many outstanding DVDs, including The Hoax, Global Warming, A Convenient Lie, Holocaust, Pro-Choice, The Myth of Roe vs. Wade, and more. Visit ironmicrophone.com. Arm yourself with information that will change minds as well as the future of our country. Order the DVDs now while they're free. Do it quickly because this offer is subject to change in 90 days. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the Store tab to order your free DVD today.
Welcome back to the home of the Iron Microphone with your hosts, Dr. Lawrence Gelman and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg.
Back with you on the Talkback Radio Network. Sorry we dropped out for a second, but we're back on now. And we're going over the Supreme Court and Dr. Gelman's point about what the Supreme Court is actually limited to. And when I was reading the U.S. Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2, in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, and those in which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. All other cases before mentioned within the judicial power of the United States, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. So, given that understanding, how can a state, let's say things like forced busing, where the federal government came in and said, through the Supreme Court, and said, this is what you must do, that we're overriding the state's jurisdiction. And your point is that that is not possible, that they are going over their own power. Is that correct?
Yes, it's non-constitutional. We have a fascist government. The Supreme Court has no authority whatsoever to force the states to do anything at all.
Okay, and if we could wrap up a little bit about what you were talking about the piece of what we're talking about, and I guess it comes down to the things that what this decision did, what the Marbury decision did at the Supreme Court.
I already said that. It essentially gave the central government the authority to determine how a state, the lives of every citizen in the country were now at the behest of the central government. The entire idea that the Supreme Court has authority over the states or the central or the people is complete nonsense. We will, the Supreme Court, for example, how many of you realize that there's no set number of Supreme Court justices, and that the number of Supreme Court justices has ranged from 6 to 10? Also, there's nothing in the Constitution which says that the Supreme Court justices have any particular, or any central government in agency or individual has any authority whatsoever over the Constitution. Says the senators and representatives and members of the several states legislatures and all executive and judicial, both of the United States, to protect the citizen from its own government. The Bill of Rights are each a single sentence meant to be understood by the average citizen and are not to be interpreted by the Supreme Court. As the Supreme Court is part of the central government, it makes as much sense for the government to have interpretive jurisdiction over the Bill of Rights as having had been required of Thomas Jefferson to have sought approval of the Declaration of Independence from King George III of England. It should come as no surprise, then, that the arch political rival of John Marshall was Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. The Supreme Court has effectively amended the Constitution through such decision as the Roe v. Wade decision granting a right to abortion. Does anything like that exist in the Constitution? Of course not. The structure of the Supreme Court precludes it from being the final say on any constitutional issue. There is an amendment process found in the Constitution. The amendment process includes the Congress and the states. Guess who it does, which party it doesn't include. The amendment process does not include the Supreme Court. The members can range from has ranged from 6 to 10, which is an even number, which is obvious. Then they could not have been the ultimate determiner of anything, because then why didn't the founding fathers create a system of tie breakage in the Supreme Court? They did not. In the Senate, there is a tie breaker because there's an even number in the Senate. Every state has 2 senators. The vice president is the tiebreaker. So the founding fathers understood the importance of tiebreaker vote, which is why they why they made the head of the Senate the vice president, who only votes in the case of a tie. Why did they not do the same with the Supreme Court? And the reason is that nothing the Supreme Court did was supposed to affect legislation. They were just supposed to see if something adhered to the Constitution or not. They were not to interpret the Constitution at all. If the founding fathers had wanted that, they would have created a tiebreaker mechanism within the Supreme Court. The systems of checks and balances is created to limit the authority and power of any one branch of government, and it has been circumvented time and again by an unrestrained federal court system headed by the Supreme Court usurping power unilaterally. If the legislative branch passes a law by a simple majority vote, the president can veto the bill. The Congress may override the veto, but only by a 2/3 majority in each house. The legislature is empowered to make laws, but their execution is up to the executive branch. Where are the checks and balances applied to Supreme Court when a simple majority or a single justice in a state or in a region can overturn state legislation? This is complete nonsense, but the purpose of it was to give the central government the authority to determine determine everything about one's individual life. Now, the rabbi brought up the issue of forced busing, and the way that the Supreme Court imposed that the ability of the central government to do that is through the Commerce Clause. And we'll get to the Commerce Clause in the last third of our program, and we'll show you how through the perversion of the Constitution that the fascist government that we have in power today was able to circumvent the Constitution and the principles of the Founding Fathers through a corruption of the Constitution, which anyone bothering to look at can find, and we'll discuss that in the last third of the program, the corruption of the Constitution by the central government in order to enslave the American people, and how they did it through the perversion of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution.
Well, let's bring on now as our guest Tom Mullen, who is the author of A Return to Common Sense, Reawakening Liberty in the Inhabitants of America. He writes weekly columns on his blog. It's been featured on the Daily Caller, Daily Paul, American Breaking Point, lots of other programs. And one of his things he wrote, which I'm really interested in, he says, this is a quote, "The federal government doesn't need a manicure, it needs reconstructive surgery." He goes on to say, make that deconstructive surgery. You don't turn $1.5 trillion of deficits into surpluses by tweaking the way the federal departments are managed. Let's hear more about that, and kind of in the same vein that we're talking this morning about how we do some reconstructive or deconstructive surgery to the federal government. Welcome to our program, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
It's good to have you on as well. And I take it you are firmly behind a lot of the stances that Congressman Paul is espousing.
Yeah, I mean, he's really fundamentally different than any candidate in any party, except maybe the Libertarian Party or the Constitution Party, and they've had trouble, of course, breaking through the gridlock that the other two parties have on the system. So, you know, he's the only alternative that I could see that would change anything at all about the way things are going.
What do you see? What do you see? Then you've some of the things I've in doing a little research in your in things you've written. You've been very critical of the Republican Party as well, as far as not embracing some of these policies and saying that they're not much better than the Democrats and what they are espousing with respect to their platform.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, all we've heard from the Republicans since President Obama took office is how terrible he is, and how no matter what, and barring anything else, the one thing they've got to do is get President Obama out. And the answer, well, why? And most of the substantive answers come from his spending and his deficits. Yet none of these other Republican candidates even promised to cut $1. Not $1 will they cut. In fact, what they call a cut are just they're not going to increase spending as much as some government accountant projected it would increase. So really what they're saying is President Obama's spending right now is just fine, and the only problem with President Obama is he's going to increase it by a little too much over the next 10 years, and I'm going to increase it a little less. That's not an answer to like you said, a $1.5 trillion deficit. You've got to change the role of government. You've got to take some things that the federal government has started doing in the last several decades and say, you don't get to do that anymore. You're spending too much money. You're bankrupting our country, and you're miring our children in debt. You don't get to do education anymore. You don't get to try to meddle with the housing market. How do you like the results? I mean, really, it baffles my mind that so many people could get behind some of these other candidates and really believe that there's going to be some fundamental change if they elect them. I mean, it's beyond the pale to think how people could arrive at that conclusion.
Well, that's a consequence of the indoctrination and the dumbing down of the American population through enforced public schooling. Actually, in my opinion, the Republican Party has been a much bigger disaster for the country than the Democrats. And I agree with you. I really don't think they're a different party at all. I think that basically you have two mafioso families fighting it out between each other. They believe in the same philosophy, basically doing in everybody else and staying in power. And it's just a competition between two mafioso families. Actually, I think the Republicans are even worse than the Democrats because they are wolves in sheep clothing, pretending to be conservative, when in fact they are not conservative at all, and they draw off conservative energy. And so I think really it's a ploy that these guys work out with each other, because I've kind of come to the conclusion that George Bush did what he did on purpose with the intention of getting Barack Obama elected president, and I think that was they did that behind closed doors. Because I would find it very difficult to believe that there could be anyone as stupid as George Bush to be president, and so politically inept as the Republican Party to be a party that can actually exist, unless it was feigned stupidity and they really were working behind the scenes with the Democrats in order to achieve the same end, which was to put all power into the central government and to basically enslave the American people.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned, and I happen to be a homeschooling parent, so I'm holding hands with you on the deficiencies in the school system. And one thing that no Americans seem to know is any history. I mean, the Republican Party was born as the party of big government, not small government. Back when Lincoln finally came in and finally got the old Whig platform, which was now called Republican, finally got it it was to expand the government. And I would argue that the people who, starting with Jefferson, who pushed back against that agenda, and I'm talking obviously about everything other than slavery, but his economic agenda, that they were really libertarians. Jefferson and the what they used to call Democratic Republicans were libertarians. And the conservatives were the big government guys back then. And it was only really after Woodrow Wilson and especially after FDR that the Republicans became the smaller government party, just relatively smaller. And, of course, as soon as they got back in with Eisenhower and after that, they completely abandoned that and went right back to big government conservatism. So, I mean, I think if you look at the whole history of the Republican Party, it was kind of an aberration that they were ever pushing for limiting the government at all. And, of course, Goldwater was a complete departure into libertarian territory. And I think they saw that when it didn't work, they came right back with big government with Nixon.
Tom, I wanted to ask you, we look at Romney today, which I think any person looking at this with any kind of objective view would say most of the collective Republicans out there look at Romney as, not particularly very excited, but maybe he's obviously garnering more, he's certainly getting more votes than anyone else is. But people aren't very excited about him. He seems to be in a stuffed shirt, and that's been used several times, and not particularly likable with respect to a lot of what Republicans want. There are a lot of Republicans that feel that he's not what they would consider to be a genuine Republican. You look out in the field. If we go back to Reagan,
he is a genuine Republican.
You think he's a genuine Republican?
That's why he's a genuine Republican. Just as we're hearing from our guest, that he epitomizes what the Republican Party has been for 90% of its duration. So that is why he's winning. He's a stuffed shirt because Republicans are. Who's more stuffed shirt than Nelson Rockefeller?
But that seems to be the people that we are gaining. Why is it also that when Ron Paul, we talk about libertarian values, when Ron Paul opens his mouth about anything about his foreign policy platform, people scatter, or they say he's not sensitive to the needs of this or that, and why is it that the Republicans have really distanced themselves from him? And as you write in some of your books and some of the things that you've authored about how the Republicans would do well to adapt some of his policies, why is there such resistance?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that, and I could give one overall answer is that, and this doesn't just apply to people who identify themselves as conservatives or Republicans, but Democrats too. I mean, the underlying problem here, and the reason we get candidates like this, is because it seems to me that the American public has no grip on reality whatsoever. And, you know, there's some support for some of this warfare from some of the really radical religious groups, and I wrote about this, that they make fun of some of Ron Paul's supporters because they believe in, you know, conspiracies and 12 guys in a room trying to run the world or something like that. But there's people that are voting for Rick Santorum because they believe that if Jewish people don't control Jerusalem, that Jesus isn't going to come back, and then they believe the world's going to end next year. And so they'd have to support the wars for these reasons. And, you know, regardless of anyone's religious beliefs, that if our political system is based on that, then we're in real trouble. And, you know, I think that is a minority of people. But there's a lot of them. And everywhere where you're seeing Rick Santorum doing better, a lot of it has to do with very, very extreme beliefs like that. Because when you look at the rest of his platform, it's no different than Romney's, and neither is Gingrich's. I mean, you can't find any dollars that they're going to cut that are different. So, you know, to me, and I think Ron Paul has said this many times, you know, they're all pretty much the same. And as far as foreign policy, I guess that's where you're coming from. You know, there's also a large contingency of people who benefit from this, whether it's employment or whether it is, you know, that they're contracting or whatever. You know, they don't want to see any of this go away, not today at least.
Do you think that when all's said and done, and whoever becomes the nominee, do you think that Ron Paul is going to have a voice? Do you think that he will have some input into what the platform will be, or do you think they're going to, the Republicans are going to say, no thanks, we've got it covered?
Well, yeah, that is the question, isn't it? Because I don't know if they know what to do with them. Of course, I don't read minds, but it's very much a reality that he's got a block of people that they need to win. That's indisputable at this point. And, you know, what do you do with this guy? If you give him a speaking slot, it's not going to be helpful. You know, and he's not the type of guy that it's going to go along to get along. Almost anybody else probably would. So I wouldn't want to be them to try to figure that dilemma out. I do know this: if they completely ostracize him, then you know, they're probably going to lose this election. So, again, I think the best thing would be get a little more sensible on your foreign policy. You know, listen a little bit and think: is it really so bad that we don't resort to bombing and invading as the first solution to every problem, rather than the very last?
Well, I don't see, even if they said that, they're not going to do it. Barack Obama, for example, came in on a peace platform, and all he did was expand the wars. So, you know, that group is entrenched. What I would like to see Ron Paul do is run as a third-party candidate, and in his third-party platform, urge the people to vote for Republican senators and representatives in order to prevent in order to prevent either the Democrats or the Republicans to be in power. And what I'm hoping for is that what he will do. I do not see the Republicans doing anything other than offering him something, a speech or something at the convention. I agree with you entirely. Ron Paul's not going to accept that. He's not going to go along just to get along. So I just don't see that. What I hope he does is, as a third-party candidate, and in his admonitions in voting for that, he say, vote for the Republicans, not because they're any good, but we want to have a government that is no longer capable of action of any kind, because any action it does take always seems to be detrimental to the nation.
Tom, we've just got a couple of moments left here with you. If people want to find out more about you, about what you talk about or whatnot, do you have a website you could direct them to?
Yeah, definitely come to tommullen.net. and that's MULLEN, TomMullen.net. And usually there's links to all the other places where my writing's featured.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on our program, and thank you for sharing a bit of your wisdom with us. And we'll see what happens in November as we get closer to this election. Thank you so much for being on our program. Our guest has been Tom Mullen, and who is a really interesting libertarian perspective that we've heard this morning. Thank you so much for being on. We'll continue in a moment with our program right here on the Talkback Radio Network.
You are listening to the Talkback Radio Network. We hope you're being enriched by our program today. You may be listening via our archives or to our live broadcast. Dr. Gelman and Rabbi Rosenberg broadcast live on Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern, 10 to 11 a.m. Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. You may call the show live during those times, toll free at 888-930-1787, 888-930-1787, or you can find us in the archives 24/7 at ironmicrophone.com.
To me, freedom of speech means having the right to say what I want in any way I choose. I can say it fast, or I can say it slow.
I can say it high,
Or I could say it low.
I can sing it,
or I can shout it from the top of a mountain.
but no matter which way I choose to speak, it is the fact that I am free to use my voice that is most important.
This message is brought to you by the NAB Education Foundation, the Broadcast Education Association, McCormick Foundation, and this station.
Dr. Lawrence Gelman is a South Texas-based physician and hospital administrator. His mission is to empower Americans with knowledge that will help change the direction of our country. Dr. Gelman has produced a series of DVDs with the facts on myriad political, social, and economic issues. At this time, he is so passionate about our country and the state of our government that he's declared a moratorium on any costs associated with his DVDs. He'll even pay the postage. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the store link. Choose from many outstanding DVDs, including The Hoax, Global Warming, A Convenient Lie, Holocaust, Pro-Choice, The Myth of Roe vs. Wade, and more. Visit ironmicrophone.com. Arm yourself with information that will change minds as well as the future of our country. Order the DVDs now while they're free. Do it quickly because this offer is subject to change in 90 days. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the Store tab to order your free DVD today.
Now, back to Talkback Radio with your hosts, Dr. Lawrence Gelman and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg.
Back with you on the Talkback Radio Network. We are talking about the Supreme Court, and off mic I was just asking Dr. Gelman about how the Supreme Court then, if they're only empowered to rule on certain things, and after Marbury that changed to a certain extent, but at the same time, the government, how much the state has with respect to power. And he mentioned before something I brought up about forced busing. And we see it all the time where the federal government will intervene, or the Supreme Court will intervene and overturn a state ruling. And your contention is that the Supreme Court is overreaching its bounds. Is that correct?
Yeah, it has no authority to do any of that stuff, and the reason it does it is not to defend the Constitution, but to increase the power of the central government. Forced busing, for example, destroyed public education in the United States. Who gave the authority, the Environmental Protection Agency, to come and dictate the emission rules? Where did the Department of Education have the authority to come and teach your school children how to put on condoms and take birth control devices and learn about sex education? Where do they have the authority to do any of that? And of course they don't. But how do they take the authority? Well, they took the authority, as any dictatorship does, as any fascist government does, is they simply usurped it. They simply took it and then gave some kind of rationale for doing it, or some kind of, and in the way this country did it, some countries you just have one guy taking over by killing a bunch of people and taking over controls of the government, or you have the philosophy, the divine right of kings, where somehow the people are indoctrinated to believe that someone can be born to rule over others yet to be born. What a bunch of nonsense that is, but that's how Europe ran for hundreds and hundreds of years. In the United States, the mechanism they used was a subversion of the Constitution through the legislation and decision-making process. And we're going to talk about the way the EPA, OSHA, Department of Education, every other agency in the United States is able to control your life unconstitutionally is through the mechanism of the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is found in Article 1 in Section 8, delineating the powers of the legislative branch. It is one clause of many clauses, and the clause says the Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, and that is all it says. Its intent was no more than to prevent individual states to set up barriers for trade between one state and another, or between a foreign country and any individual state. That's all it was meant to do. But in the Gibbons versus Ogden decision in 1824, the central government contrived to gain control over not simply the interchange of goods and services, but control over the means of production and providers of service. The Gibbons versus Ogden decision, written by, once again, great fascist Justice John Marshall of Marbury versus Madison fame, stated in this decision, the sovereignty of Congress, so limited to specified object, is plenary. Plenary meaning all-inclusive as to those objects. With the statement, though limited to specified objects, Marshall illustrates that he understands the federal government is denied implied powers by the 9th and 10th Amendments, but seeks to circumvent this limitation by stating Congress to specified objects are plenary. Under such preposterous reasoning, anything mentioned in the Constitution comes under complete control of the government. Once assuming absolute authority over everything mentioned in the wording of the Constitution, Marshall then proceeds to make up definitions for words. If you look up in Merriam-Webster dictionary, commerce is defined as an interchange of goods, services, or currency between parties. It was redefined by Marshall to encompass all components in the production of goods or in the providing of services. Every single aspect of it, not just the commerce or the trading between individuals or entities, but the actual production or the actual provision of those services. That is not found in the Constitution. Despite Marshall's machinations in twisting meanings and ignoring intent, Marshall is still constrained by an absolute prohibition on meddling in the internal affairs of a state. For in his decision he says, the completely internal commerce of a state then may be considered as reserved for the state itself. But under Marshall's contrived definition of commerce, why should the federal government omit regulation of intrastate commerce, commerce that remains within a state? What would be the difference if our founding fathers had meant regulation of manufacturing and providers of services? If that is actually within the government regulatory powers, then what difference would it have made if the commerce is confined to within a state, or is commerce between states? Unless, which is the truth, that there never was an intent to regulate commerce in the manner that Marshall and the federal government contrived without any basis. So one looks at the Constitution and reads it, and which is why it's not taught in schools. That's the reason it's not taught in schools. It'll be clear as to how far outside the Constitution our government now functions. Now, even the statist Marshall, despite his corruption of language, content, and intent, at least limited his distortions of interpretation to the written word. It would be 118 years later when an even more unscrupulous court, the 1942 Supreme Court, at the behest of the great fascist himself, and I'm sure you know who I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, would discard even Marshall's limitation in the Wickard versus Filburn decision, which concluded that commerce confined exclusively within one state could somehow directly affect commerce confined exclusively in another state. Through such torturous, absurd construction was the already unconstitutional regulation of manufacturing and regulation over services of goods traded between states expanded further to encompass all the nation's manufacturing and services. Now, despite all these gyrations, the whole exercise is ultimately a study in interpretive contortion. For if you read the Commerce Clause, what does it say? It says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Foreign nations and Indian tribes are in the same clause without any distinction. So, by the court's interpretation, that would necessarily mean that if it is applied to the states, it must be applied to the Indian tribes and foreign countries. Could the Founding Fathers really have presumed an authority over commerce within sovereign foreign nations? Nor, needless to say, would any sovereign foreign nation allow such an intrusion into its internal affairs. If, and of course that is nonsensical, we could not impose our regulations on a foreign nation, and if we cannot do it with a foreign nation, then by the wording of the Commerce Clause, we cannot do it within the United States either. The government could never have been intended to impose regulatory control over the actual production of goods or provision of services. The only aspect of commerce that could reasonably be regulated by the central government equally to all the entities named, foreign countries and Indian tribes, is in the interchange of goods or services between states and other nations, between states and Indian tribes, and does not possibly include regulation over the actual manufacturing of goods or the providers of services. This is made even more evident if you read the Constitution, because the only other reference to regulation of commerce is found in Article 1, Section 9, which says, "No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another." Clearly, the Commerce Clause is just in the interchange of goods and services between entities. It has nothing to do with the actual production of services or the production of goods or provision of services. Adding further to the disconnect between the decision and the intent is the unconstitutional transference of an enumerated power from one branch of government to another. The regulation of commerce is enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, which delineates the powers of the legislative branch. But the power of regulation resides in the bureaucracies of the executive branch, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Committee of Medicare and Medicaid, the Department of Education, the Department of Interior, and etc., and all the rest. And with bureaucrats acting via these powers, acting outside of legislation, and who are only answerable not to the people but to the executive branch, insulating the central government from the will of the people. Through such contrivance is the country taken to ever greater degrees of government repression. The purposeful distortion of the Commerce Clause aptly demonstrates the federal government's unabashed ignorance of constitutional principles, arbitrarily exercising centralized regulatory control indistinguishable from any other totalitarian state. The citizen has been brought under a regulatory yoke applied by an army of autocratic petty bureaucrats, crafting and then applying regulations wantonly, wielding authority arbitrarily, answerable to no one, and prone to gross misfeasance, nonfeasance, and malfeasance. Bureaucrats appointed by the president, now through decree rather than legislation, can create law without participation by the Congress and without the consent of the people. Federal government intrusion into private enterprise has become essentially unlimited in scope. The federal government has thus nationalized legislation, applying mandates coercively enforced, assessing economic punishments to states which wish to be free, implementing oppressive regulations, and promoting the evisceration of every effort of the independent citizenry to shake off the shackles of central government authoritarianism. Everything that we do is now controlled by bureaucrats in the executive branch, and they hold the states and the individual's money hostage, that if you don't follow the mandate of the government, you will not receive your Medicare funds, your Medicaid funds, your highway funds, having first stolen all the money from the citizen, putting it in the hands of the central government, and if you want any of that money back, you had better kneel to the dictates of the fascists in Washington, D.C.
So with everything that you've said this morning about this and about what's wrong with it, and I wanted to give people I don't know if we didn't get a chance to toss out our number at the beginning, 1-888-930-1787, 1-888-930-1787. With this understanding of the Commerce Clause that you have given and whatnot.
It's not what I have given.
It's
Read
the
it
Constitution.
yourself.
I know, it's the Constitution.
Okay?
But, okay. Obviously, either our legislators don't read the same thing, or they don't know it, or the government is operating on another understanding of it. And how I understand what the issue is, and you've laid it out very, very well. So the question is, how do you
much better than anywhere else you've heard, not like that fool Mark Levin who parades around like a constitutional attorney who knows nothing about the Constitution, and that goes for his little sidekicks, Sean Hannity, the ditch digger, and who has the mentality of a ditch digger, and the Sean Hannity is really no different than somebody who follows one baseball team versus Bill Maher, who follows another baseball team. They both are the same intellect, which is ditch digger. I'm sorry. Let me apologize to the ditch diggers. Okay, I'm sorry about that. To mention Sean Hannity or Bill Maher is in that vein, or the other little lapdog, which is who's the other lapdog?
Well, there's
Limbaugh. Yeah, he's the other lapdog who's shown his true colors in attacking Ron Paul. Yes.
Yes, and so you're right, and you have people. Of
course, I'm right.
Of course, you're right, and you have, and I would say Sean Hannity falls into that line as a Kool-Aid drinker, and
he's an equal employment, equal opportunity employer for that suspender jerk. What's the guy's name? Bob Beckel or whatever.
Bob Beckel. Yeah. Well, he has his
I want to apologize to all the jerks out there for mentioning Bob Beckel in your group. By the way,
I thought you'd apologize to all the people who wear suspenders.
And I want to apologize. No, that's not true, because pretty much most of the people who wear suspenders are phony baloney Yankee attorneys out of Connecticut or New York. So, no, I'm not going to apologize to the suspenders guys.
Okay, or Larry King.
What a travesty that guy is.
But how do you really feel?
Larry King and Bob Beckel and Sean Hannity are a testament to the enforced ignorance of the American people. And by the way, I throw Oprah Winfrey in that group, by the way. I'm across, I don't want to get just one gender. I want to have all genders involved.
So why are people afraid to step up and talk about what these issues are?
They're not afraid. They're not aware. They're not aware. The system of public education exists to dumb people down, to indoctrinate them. For 12 years, you're in a North Korean brainwashing system, which is what we have in our country. It's not stupidity. It's not a question of intellect. It's a question of ignorance. I'm not saying the American people are stupid. I'm just saying they're ignorant, and there's a big difference between the two. But the ignorance is purposeful. And it's purposeful by the government, because an ignorant population is an easily controlled population. All of these things that I'm finding out here on my own, they're all available, of course, for anyone who wants to look it up. But the fact of the matter is that none of this is enunciated through any of the media, including so-called conservative Fox News, or through any of the pundits, including so-called conservatives, Mark Levin, so-called phony baloney constitutional lawyer, or Rush Limbaugh, or Sean Hannity. They really don't understand what this country is all about, and And evidence of that is their continuing attacks on the only true American ideologue, which is Ron Paul.
It was something that we had mentioned, that I alluded to with Tom Mullen before. There seems to be this animus in the Republican Party against Ron Paul.
I don't understand why you keep bringing up this point. We've said it over and over again why that exists. I mean, can you move on to some other thing?
No,
you're just repeating the same thing over and over again. There's an animus towards him the same way that there's an animus of the Jews towards the Nazis.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it's the same thing. There's an animus of the Republican Party towards Ron Paul because Ron Paul is the antithesis to everything the Republican Party stands for, which is foreign intervention and big government. So, of course, there's an animus there.
You had mentioned that you thought Ron Paul might do well as a third-party candidate.
I have no illusions that he would win as a third-party candidate. My concern is that the Democrats will regain the House and the Senate and the presidency, and that needs to be avoided. It would be much better if Ron Paul runs for president and then urges his followers to vote for Republican senatorial and congressional candidates. Let Barack Obama win the presidency. Let the House and the Senate go on to the Republicans. Not that either group is American ideologue or follows American or constitutional ideology, but to stop the government from doing anything at all. Gridlock is good. That is the only way we can save ourselves from the depredations foisted upon us by these two mafioso families, the Democrats and the Republicans.
So you're saying that checks and balances are good, that those are the ways that we can...
The entire basis of the United States government, the basis of the Constitution, is upon a system of checks and balances, which has been completely destroyed. We now have a hierarchical system in which there are no checks and balances.
On that note, we will continue next week, and hopefully this has helped you learn a little bit more about how our government works, or doesn't work for that matter. We'll see you next week, the same time, Thursday at 11 o'clock Eastern. Until then, for Dr. Lawrence Gelman, I'm Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg. You take care. We'll see you next week.